Welcome back to a new episode of Spanish Vibes in Motion. Today we're going to learn the difference of use between ser and estar. Unfortunately, the use of ser and estar causes a lot of challenges to the students that are learning this new language because they are told in a summarized way that the verb ser is used for expressing situations that are permanent and the verb estar is used for situations that are temporary. Although somehow it's right, it's not 100% accurate, and we need to learn the exact rules in order to use it as much clear or as much correct as possible. I'm not telling you that is something very easy. We need to understand some rules and then practice it, right? But with this exercise, what we're going to do is just to give you more confidence and clarify the panorama in order for you to speak as much correct as possible. So let's start with the verb ser. The verb ser is a verb of essence. It's a verb that deals with the identity of the person or the thing that we are talking about, right? And when we are building sentences with the verb ser, we normally connect the subject A with that type of trait, right? Or that noun that describes that subject, right? So we say, for example, Laura es alta, right? Telling something about the identity of Laura, right? That she is tall. And on the other side, we can say that, yes, the verb ser can express situations that are permanent. For example, like Laura is alta, Laura will be forever tall, right? But there are situations in which I use the verb ser, for example, for saying Juana es estudiante, meaning that she is already a student, right? But at some point she will graduate and she will be no longer a student, but we use the verb ser. So this is a general description. Let's see the uses of the verb ser, right, in this inventory, right, of 10 parts, and then we will move on to see the verb estar. Number one, just to identify people, right, or objects. For example, I can say, yo soy Eduardo. Estos son cuadros, right? We can use also the verb ser to express nationality, to express background, to express origins. For example, yo soy argentino. Yo soy de Buenos Aires. Yo soy descendiente de franceses y alemanes. We can use ser also to express the profession or the activity. For example, I can say, yo soy profesor de español, or yo soy contador público. Or I can also say, yo soy estudiante de alemán e italiano. The verb ser is also used to express of the material of what something is being made, right? For example, la mesa es de madera. Or I can talk about the shape, right? I can say la mesa es redonda. Or I can talk about, for example, other characteristics and say la mesa es baja. The verb ser is also used to express property. Estos cuadros son míos. We can also use the verb ser to express purpose, objective, use. And I could say, for example, esos lentes son para leer. We can use the verb ser also to tell the chronological time. For example, son las 5 de la tarde. Or we can say, hoy es sábado. We can also express hoy es sábado 17 de julio. And we can say as well, ahora En Argentina es invierno. The verb ser is also used when we talk about numbers, when we talk about prices or quantities. For example, ¿cuánto es? Son 10 euros. Or, for example, ¿cuántos son en la clase? Somos 15 estudiantes. But when we talk partially about that total quantity, we say somos 15 en la clase, pero hoy estamos 4. We use the verb ser also for expressing opinions, ideology, or regulations. For example, yo no soy radical, yo soy liberal, or es necesario usar visa para ir a los Estados Unidos. Finally, the 10th case is related of the use of ser to place an event in space and time. For example, I can say, la cena es en el restaurante que fuimos la semana pasada, or la cena es a las 9 de la noche. But if we are talking about of the dinner, right? La cena as an object, we use the verb estar when we talk about its location in space. For example, la cena está en la nevera. Let's see the conjugation of the verb ser in the present tense.
Yo soy, tú eres, vos sos, él, ella, usted es, nosotros somos, vosotros sois, ellos, ellas, ustedes son.
Now let's see the case of the verb estar. The verb estar, similarly to the verb ser, is a linking verb, right? It connects two parts, the subject, right, and the state, right? And the linking is the verb, right? A is linked to B, the state. The situation here is that the verb estar is related more to the state, to the circumstances of the object or the person, right? So we may have two situations, right? The situation when that verb of state relates to things that are permanent, for example, that Laura está siempre nerviosa, or we can say also as a temporary thing that Laura está nerviosa, right? There are two things completely different. Now let's see the uses of the verb estar specifically. One of the first uses is the placement of the object or the person in a specific space. For example, Juan está en el jardín. Los niños están en el colegio. Estar is also used to express the circumstances or the state of the person or the thing. Laura está alegre. Laura está triste. Los niños están felices. We're talking about these that are adjectives, right? But we can also use adverbs, for example, and say Laura está bien or Laura está mal. The verb estar is also to express an action that in English is similar to the present continuous, right? Laura está trabajando, meaning Laura is working, right? And at the same time, it also expresses a situation of a state, right, that involve the participle. For example, the case of Julio César está muerto. Finally, the last case related to the use of the verb estar is to express company. For example, when we say Laura está con su madre. So, after overviewing the uses of the verb ser and estar, let's see the new situation in which the verb ser or estar could be used alternatively. And this is where we need to pay more attention.
After learning the specific uses of ser and estar, let's see the combined use of adjectives when ser and estar can be used alternatively. We must keep in mind that the linking verb estar is the marked verb. That means that the estar only is used in a few occasions, and those occasions are defined, whereas ser is used in all other cases where estar is not used. We have seen that on the left side we see more alternatives for ser rather than for estar. Now we will move on to concentrate on the intersection of both circles, where the use of both verbs may be common. At the start of this video, we mentioned that some people tend to oversimplify the differences between the two verbs, saying that ser is associated with a permanent identity and estar with a temporary situation. We only can start thinking about this permanent temporary issue once we have discarded the specific uses already explained earlier in this video. Now you will understand, for example, that it's correct to say París está en Francia without hesitating its permanent status versus the temporary mandate of estar, because now you understand that we are referring to the first rule of estar that dictates that the star is used for placing a person or an object in space. In the world of adjectives, we now can say that if we are describing a situation that is permanent, we will use the verb ser. For example, Laura es alegre. And if we are describing a situation that is temporary, applicable to a specific moment in time, I would say Laura está alegre. This is an example of adjectives whose meanings do not change but may reflect a permanent or temporary status. In other cases, the meaning can change completely. So, we must understand those cases particularly. If I say, soy listo, it means that I am smart. Whereas, if I say, estoy listo, that means I am ready. Ella es orgullosa, she is arrogant. Ella está orgullosa, she is proud. Here, there are other adjectives whose meanings changes when we are using ser or estar. There are cases that the use of ser and estar are indistinctive. They mean the almost same either if we use one verb or another. It is as if the difference in meaning disappeared. For example, when we use the adjective ciego, we can say soy ciego or estoy ciego, or to say es tonto or está tonto, or to say es viudo or está viudo. Finally, we have the passive voice, for which the Spanish language has two different approaches. One is that is called the passive voice of process, where the verb ser is used and gives the idea of continuity, of repetition, as if the action continued repeatedly. It expresses an action that extends over time. Saying las puertas son cerradas a las 12 means that the doors are being closed by somebody every day at noon. The passive voice of result, where estar is used, gives the idea of a perfective aspect, meaning that the event was finished and what we see is the result of a completed action. It is not prone to continue repeatedly, but finished. Las puertas están cerradas, los libros están escritos en inglés.
Now let's see the conjugation of the verb estar in the present tense.
Yo estoy, tú estás, vos estás, él, ella, usted, está, nosotros, estamos, vosotros, estáis, ellos, ellas, ustedes, están.
Thanks for staying with us today in this episode of Spanish Vibes in Motion. We hope you have enjoyed the episode and you have learned something new about the differences between ser and estar. See you next time and have a great day. Bye bye.